Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another recap. This time, the third round of Hart House Holidays Open. So, after round two, uh, where I had such a bad position, a dead loss position against Ethan Moon, and somehow I managed to get out a draw out of it, I was still pretty motivated and happy. I was at 1.5 out of 2, having a good tournament. But I was facing a dangerous player, Noah Kim. He's a national master. He was already having an amazing tournament. He beat a 2200 rated player in round one, and he drew a FIDE Master in round two. So he was having an amazing tournament coming into this game. He was on a sensational form, and I know he's a very sharp player. He's like 2900 bullets online, so he's very fast with calculations and tactics. So this is a type of game where it can possibly be dangerous. Like, let's say we get into a very ambiguous position with a lot of tactics going on. There's a lot of chance I might blunder something and lose the game. So even though I was confident, I was a little bit scared. I knew I had to be on my best form to be able to win this game. So I actually played Noah twice before. It was a Blitz tournament where in the Blitz tournaments in Canada we faced each other twice with both colors. I actually won both of those games, but I remember in both of the games he gave me a very tough game. Both of the games were super competitive. And I remember that the first time we played in the Blitz tournament, I started with e4 and he started with c5. And I played knight c3 Sicilian. And I remember he had a good opening. Like, he played a good line against my knight c3 Sicilian repertoire, and he got a decent position out of the opening. So I was thinking it's better to maybe change my openings. I also prepared a little bit for the Caro-Kann because I saw he plays some Caro-Kann as well. But I was mostly expecting Sicilian. I decided to go with the Alapin, the c3 Sicilian. And I just saw very briefly that online he plays the knight f6 line, so I reviewed my lines very briefly before the game. And he played this line knight c6, which is sometimes a very tactical and complicated line. So there are two ways to play this position. Like, there are many ways, but the main two ways are d4 and bishop c4, and I decided to go with bishop c4. Attacking the knight on d5, he plays knight b6, I drop the bishop back, he goes c4, and I drop the bishop back to c2. So it looks like black is getting a lot of space advantage, and the pawn on e5 is becoming a little bit weak in some lines. So I just want to mention very briefly about an opening idea. If black goes queen c7 in this position, putting pressure on the pawn on e5, queen e2 defending the pawn is not the best move because then black has the idea of going g5, and then white needs to know what he's doing in this position. It's going to get very tricky. But I have this idea that I can sack the pawn on e5 and try to play for initiative. I don't want to really go into the opening details and reveal all of my preparation, but I just wanted to mention this idea as well. My opponent played d5, which is one of the main moves. I take, he takes with a queen, and I castle. So we get this position. It's a very common position. It has been played over 400 times at the top level. And it looks like black is slightly better. Like, white's pieces are looking very cramped on the queen side. Black has a lot of space with his pawn on c4. Looks like bishop g4, long castle is coming. And in the first glance, it might look like black is the one in the driving seat. But in reality, there are problems for black as well. This pawn on c4 is a strength, kind of like hampering the activity of white's pieces, but at the same time, it can be a target. It can be attacked by b3, and it can be attacked by knight a3, queen e2 ideas, combined with b3, of course. And once white gets rid of this pawn and plays something like d4, then white all of a sudden is going to get a lot of activity in the position. So the main line here goes bishop g4, which my opponent didn't play. And the best for white is just to go rook e1, and one line goes long castle, trying to really put pressure on the d file and stop d4 or d3. But then white will play something like knight a3 with queen e2 ideas, trying to put some more pressure on the pawn on c4. So there's this other line as well that I saw in one of the other games of our section in exactly the next round being played. Black played knight e5, rook e5, bishop f3, queen e1, and then dropping the bishop back to c6. Like there are a lot of ways for black to play this position, and it's a very imbalanced position, but it's equal, so both sides have their own chances. Actually, black won the game that was played in our section with this position. Anyways, so my opponent did not play bishop g4. My opponent played the move e5, which seems natural in the first place, opening up the bishop and getting more control over the center. But it's not a good move. And the reason it's not a good move is that white gets a chance to immediately strike with a move b3, trying to get rid of the pawn on c4. So in a game my opponent took, which is a natural move again, but it was maybe better to play bishop g4 and try to keep the tension here. Of course, white is going to take. And here it becomes a little bit of like engine ideas. I don't think that's really human. So if my opponent takes the pawn back, I will again get some initiative with h3, queen e2, knight goes back, and now d4. And all of a sudden, with a king in the middle and d5 coming, position is not comfortable for black, and black might lose a pawn. But after bc4, apparently there's long castle right away, just ignoring the pawn on c4. And if white defends it, then knight d7. And looks like black has some sort of long-term compensation with these pawns coming down the board. Maybe some queen c7, bishop d6, rook h8. And black has a harmonious position. But of course, this was not a very human way of playing the position. My opponent, understandably, took on b3. I took back. Now he plays queen c7, opening up the bishop on f8. There was also this other issue that bishop a3 was coming to try and trade on f8. And in this case, black will lose the castling rights. So he played queen c7. Very sensible move. And now I found the best move in the position. I was like, my position, structurally speaking, is not that much better. Of course, I have a little bit more control over the center with this two pawns versus the A and B pawns, but it's not a big deal. And if I let black develop pieces like bishop d6, bishop e6 castles, then the play is going to be equal at best. So I was like, I need to play with initiative. I need to play with tempo and not let my opponent develop their pieces. I shouldn't give them time to get all these pieces into play. So I played the move d4, playing for the initiative. So already I'm threatening to take on e5, and it's not easy to take back because rook e1 is going to come, and there's going to be some pressure with this king stuck in the middle. Understandably, my opponent took. I took back with a knight, and here he makes a mistake. He should not have underestimated my initiative here, and he should have played something like bishop e7, accepting the fact that after a move like rook e1, castles, knight c6, b6, he's going to have the worst structure with weakness on a7, and also like some attacking prospects for me against the king with these two bishops. But of course, psychologically speaking, it's tough in a real game to go for a position like this because it's obviously white who's in the driving seat here, and black needs to defend against all of the threats on the king side, and if he does, he's still going to get pressed with the weaknesses on the queen side. So he decided to take, not to ruin his pawn structure, but now I take with a queen. And now the queen on d4 is amazing. This bishop on f8 can't be developed because the pawn on g7 is going to hang. At the same time, long castling is not really possible because of the rook on a1 pointing towards the a7 pawn, and also like it's not even being physically legal with a queen on d4. So this king is stuck in the middle for now. And it's difficult for black to really consolidate the position. He played bishop e6, which is the best move. But what's coming next? It's very difficult to develop these pieces without making more weaknesses. If they go f6, then rook e1 is going to be dangerous. So already here I was feeling like his position is going to be very difficult to play. I wasn't sure how big my advantage was, but I was sure that practically speaking, this is going to be an insanely difficult task for my opponent. Here I played a strong move, but it wasn't the best move. I played knight a3. Idea was to go knight b5 and put pressure on the a7 pawn, and also, of course, develop a piece. But the best move was actually rook d1. Very calm move. And the point is, black's only real idea to try and untangle here is to play queen c5. trying to trade the queens. But then I play queen e4, attacking the pawn on b7. He has to offer the trade again. Now I can play bishop e3. And in this position, black is losing a pawn by force. I'm threatening to take on c6 and then take the knight on b6. And if the knight goes to d5, to get out of this threat, now I can simply take the pawn on a7. And of course, the bishop can't be trapped because then I can just trade the queens and win the second pawn. So rook d1, even if black plays the best way, would have won the second pawn. Would have won a pawn at least. Like even knight d5, which is the top move, just loses a7. I think the downside of knight a3 was that I was blocking the a file for my pieces, for my rook. And my opponent started playing some good moves. He played a6, I played bishop f4, and now queen c5. And all of a sudden, this time, the pawn on a7 is not vulnerable as it was in the previous lines. So here, I was debating for a long time between two moves. I was debating between bishop e3 and bishop e5. So if black takes the queen, they're going to lead to the same thing. Bishop e5, queen takes, bishop takes, or bishop e3, queen takes, bishop takes. But I was thinking, what other options black has against each of these moves? So I was thinking bishop e5 looks more forcing initially because it attacks the pawn on g7, and of course f6 is not possible because I simply sack the bishop and the rook and the bishop are going to hang. But then I started seeing this move knight d7, and I wasn't really sure. I saw him winning a pawn on g7, but I felt like after getting a position like this in an endgame, black has a lot of activity, and I wasn't sure with all these weaknesses and active rook coming to g4, I will be able to win this game. In fact, this is much better for white, but not clearly winning. In fact, it's better to take with a king. I was thinking about taking with a knight as well, but here after bishop e4, apparently the advantage is much bigger. But I was in general worried about situations where I take on g7, and in return, black gets so much activity for the pawn. So instead, I decided to play bishop e3, and here he had one move that he could play, which would have got him a little bit close to equality, and that's the move rook c8, which he didn't play. And if I go bishop e4, centralizing my bishop, attacking the pawn, then play will continue like knight d5, check, trade the queens, and we get an endgame like this where white has two strong bishops in the middle of the board, and still black is going to struggle with developing the dark squared bishop. The pawn structure is a little bit weak. The endgame is definitely holdable with correct play, but still a very unpleasant task ahead for black to defend this position. My opponent played knight d7, which is a very understandable move. The knight on b6 is a little bit loose, of course. Like, there are always threats like queen e4, opening up this bishop, so I really understand the knight d7 move. Now I centralize the bishop, and here he made another understandable decision, but it's not a good one. He played queen c8 because he was worried of this endgame after queen takes d4, and rightly so, because first things first, if I take with a bishop, it's not a good move because he's going to go knight c5, and now he's getting very close to equality. I can of course win a pawn, which might be scary again, like with the passed c-pawn coming down the board, but a bishop here at least compensates a little bit for the pawn, and the bishops in an open position can actually be much stronger than this bad knight on a3. So I'm not sure whether this was the line he was scared of, the line with losing the pawn, or the line where I take with a c-pawn, which is actually the top engine move, because now I'm threatening to win the pawn on b7, and I'm also threatening to push d5. And if he tries to simply develop and gets castled, then knight c4 comes. Castles, takes, like, play can continue something like this. Again, white is going to win a pawn probably, and black is going to have to defend this long endgame down a pawn with zero chances of winning. So I totally understand why he didn't take on d4. He just didn't want to play a depressing endgame with zero chances of winning and getting pressed for like 4 hours. So he played queen c8, keeping the queens on the board, but the problem is with a king stuck in the middle, keeping the queens on the board can turn out to be disastrous for my opponent. Here though, I was getting a little bit worried. I'm completely winning, objectively, but I was getting worried because I was starting to see some ghosts. Like, I was seeing bishop c5 ideas, but then I have queen takes g7. But then I was like, wait a minute, what if he goes knight f6, kicks my bishop away, and then goes bishop e7 castles? If he can get that, if he can play knight f6, bishop e7 castle without any issues, then he's going to equalize. Like, in the long run, he's going to equalize because the structure is symmetrical, and then he might make a draw. Like, this again shows the difference between two types of advantages in chess. You have static advantages, like let's say my pawn structure is better. I can make 10 normal moves and still my pawn structure is going to be better. But if it's a dynamic advantage like that, like a lead in development, the king stuck in the middle, lack of coordination between my opponent's pieces, I need to play with tempo. I need to not give them time to consolidate the position. And here I spent a very long time. I didn't find the best move. The best move was actually play knight c4. This move was extremely strong because now, first of all, if knight f6, then knight b6 ideas are going to come. So I stop knight f6. In the game, I was a little bit worried of playing this structure with doubled c-pawns. Because now, again, if I don't play with tempo, with initiative very well, and black can somehow castle, then I might even be in trouble in an endgame with the bad pawn structure. But of course, this is never going to happen because rook fb1, threatening b7. Black keeps defending, I will give a check, bishop f5, queen d8, rook d1. Like, the initiative is just so strong. In fact, the queen is simply trapped on d8. And black is still not castled yet. So, I kind of underestimated my initiative here after knight c4. The best is actually queen c7. But again, after rook fb1, black can't really go knight f6. Looks as though he can, but now I have this move bishop f4. They can't take because of bishop check and collecting the queen. And if the queen moves here, then these pawns are going to fall. I'm going to be up a couple of pawns. So knight c4 was crushing, but I played bishop g5. And my idea with bishop g5 was to stop knight f6. I was worried of knight f6 attacking my bishop and then getting these pieces developed. So my opponent had a very nice move here, which I think from a human's perspective is not an easy move, and it's the move f6. He's attacking the bishop, yes, but now it really weakens the e-file. Looks as though after rook fe1, bishop f5 ideas, this king is going to be in deep trouble. Like, one of my initial ideas in the game was to go rook fe1, but that's not a good move because he can just simply go bishop c5. Very nice intermezzo, and after queen d2, he just castles. Of course, taking is not going to work because of the pin on the e-file. But after the castling, there's literally no advantage left for white. A little bit of advantage, but nothing crazy. Black is totally fine here. The best I had after f6 was to play knight c4 though. Again, sacrificing the bishop. And if he takes the bishop, now I have rook fe1, rook a1, or rook fe1. And now the difference is that bishop c5 can be met by queen takes g7 with opening this diagonal for the queen by sacking the piece. And if he goes something like bishop c5, I can make this trade and drop the bishop back. And of course, with weaker king and my bishop pair, I have a long-term advantage to play for. I would have probably thought after f6, but I thought it's a tough decision for him to make. And he made a decision that I was expecting him to make, and that was to play knight c5, attacking my bishop and the pawn. I drop back my bishop, queen d7, and I drop back my queen. I played this move pretty fast. Looks as though it's the only move, but I actually could allow the queen trade with rook fe1, and the point is he can't take because I will take back, attack the knight, and threaten d5. So everything is great, and white is going to be winning here. But I blitzed queen e3, which is still a good move. And he played queen c6, which I didn't like. The moment he played it, I was like, this can't be a good move. Because the queen on c6 is extremely vulnerable to a bishop coming to e4. I'm going to go b4, bishop e4 next, and black is going to be in some sort of trouble. The best he had was to go h6, but still after a move like bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, it's really difficult to develop the pieces. Bishop can't come here because the knight hangs. If the bishop goes there, then I will just go b4, kick the knight, rook fd1, and you can easily see that black's pieces are just all over the place. After queen c6, I can even consider taking and going knight c4 with tempo on the queen. Like, there are a lot of things and resources that white has, and black's position has just too many weaknesses. So he was already in a tough position here after queen e3. He played queen c6. I played b4. And of course, if he moves the knight back, then bishop b4 is too strong. The queen has to go back again. And then I have bishop b5 ideas using this pin with some rook f1 coming next. Black just doesn't have development. That's the problem. I didn't give him time to continue the development. So he plays h6, counterattacking my bishop, and I play bishop h4. And again, knight d7, bishop e4 is pretty much hopeless. Like the best the computer gives after that is just to go queen b6 and probably lose both of these pawns, which is dead loss. So he tried g5, and here I have a very nice way to win the game. You guys can pause the video and think how to finish off the game as white. Alright, the way I finished off the game was to simply take the knight. And looks as though, of course, he's going to take the bishop. If he plays bishop c5, then queen e5, attacking the rook, just secures the piece, and I will win the game. So he has to take. But now I play this very nice move, queen to d4, attacking the rook on h8, and also threatening to play bishop a4 and win the queen. Note that after b5, I have en passant with cb6. So these two threats are unstoppable at the same time. And my opponent here was already, of course, my opponent already knew that he's lost. So he tried to throw the kitchen sink. He played bishop takes c5, sacrificing both rooks on h8 and a8, and trying to go with h3, trying to create something against my king, but it's simply not enough. Like, you have only two bishops and a queen, and of course, I just go queen g8, guard the pawn on g2, and there's no attack left. I'm simply up a couple of rooks. Like, he played f5 in the game, but if he had taken on g2, I simply take with a queen, bishop d5, and I just give a check on e1 to the king. The king goes to the d file, I have rook a d1, the pin is deadly. I can even like trade everything on d5 and win the game very simply. And if the king goes to f8, then bishop e4, trading the light squared bishops, and my king is the safest king in the world here with all these pieces around it, and I'm up a couple of rooks again. So he tried f5, but I simply give a check on g7. The rook is going to come to e1 next, and I'm up two rooks, and my king is, I guess, a little bit even safer. So in this position, my opponent resigned the game, and I got a pretty comfortable win against a strong opponent. I think his problem, though, started from the opening. Like, the main problem for him was that he didn't know how to play this position. So he made some normal decisions like e5, taking the pawn, or like trading on d4, and he landed in an extremely uncomfortable position where he couldn't complete his development. And here, from this point, it was a matter of whether I will be able to use my initiative before my opponent consolidates, and I managed to do it. It wasn't the cleanest of games. It wasn't like I made all the best moves, but I was in control all the time, and my opponent always had to solve a lot of difficult problems and a lot of difficult challenges with his development. So let me enter the result here real quick. I won this game. I moved to 2.5 out of 3 points. So I was getting close to the leaders. The leader of the tournament after this round was Grandmaster Razvan Priotu, who was facing another international master at 2.5 points. And I was the only other person at 2.5 points facing an international master at 2 points in a very exciting game that I will cover in the next recaps. Anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this recap. Make sure to let me know your comments about this game and about the recaps in general in the comments down below. Subscribe to the channel to be notified about the future content. There are still 2 more exciting games to come from the same tournament, and maybe some other content as well after that. So make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to be notified about the future content. And I hope to see you guys very, very soon. Thank you so much. Goodbye.